Welcome. Very nice to see everybody again who was here last time and to see some new faces. Each lecture hopefully stands on its own, although each time I think I'm going to reprise all of the previous one, and then when I got finished writing the second one, I realized there was no time to do a reprise. So last time I talked about violence against women as a tool of control. For those of you who missed it, I will be putting the video of the lectures up on my author's website in due course. We all know what that means, but it's a very positive thing. If you want me to send you an email when that happens, just add your name to my email list that's on the front desk there, and I'll just send you a notice saying it's up if you're interested in watching it. As it was when I talked about violence against women, I probably had twice as much material as I was able to have time to deliver it. It shows you just what a big problem that one is. But today is another big problem for women. It's about empowering women at work. Women need power in order to achieve equality. It almost seems obvious, doesn't it? But it's something that we've had a difficult time trying to get. Equality of power under the rule of law is, in my opinion, the way to ensure the fair and equal treatment of women. Women have been treated unfairly throughout human history, and there's no justification for this, particularly now that male brute strength isn't relevant anymore, and women can control our reproduction. We can't leave it to the patriarchy to take the initiative to be fair or share power, because they've been reluctant and resistant so far. But women have to be part of the solution. We have to put ourselves forward. We have to take charge. We have to assert and insist on our rights. We can't accept the status quo and shrug that that's just the way things are. We can't be defeatist, for without strong effort on our part, there will be no change. Instead, our rights will likely be diminished. And I set out, by the way, in my book, Fairly Equal, some of the advances that we got that were then diminished when we weren't looking and how they were diminished. I set them out as a warning of what to look out for. Now, traditionally, women were assumed to be subordinate to and dependent on men. The social contract was that men provided and women nurtured. If women worked outside the home, they did so for extras or out of necessity. Women were the household servants, laundresses, sowers and reapers in the fields, teachers and caregivers to the children of the rich, and more. Women have been part of the paid labor force in a significant way only for about the last 50 years. It was only in the 1970s when the influx of women into paid jobs really grew. And I suspect a major factor was control of childbirth. The birth control pill became available in the 1960s. Contraception and abortion under limited conditions had been legalized in 1969. Even though we were paid workers, we continued to be regarded as inferior beings as compared to men. Now, in the last lecture, I went at length into the history of women in our society. So that's sort of a one-sentence summary. Our first roles when we entered the paid labor force about 50 years ago were as supports for male bosses, as secretaries in offices, sometimes called the office wife, as nurses or doctors' handmaidens, and teachers of the young, or service workers. In the early days of women's labor force participation, women worked in female ghettos and were discouraged from the professions and management levels. Those in charge in government did not concern themselves with how women would be able to both work and care for their children and their homes. Childcare was considered the family's responsibility, i.e., the mothers. Let's be absolutely clear about that. In order to empower women in the workplace, we need proper compensation, we need childcare, to be acknowledged as important to society and therefore an important part of a government's budget. In the context of women at work, I will be talking today about childcare, pay equity, employment equity, sexual harassment, and women in management and on corporate boards, and how improvements will potentially empower women at work. Childcare. Women will never be able to take our full place in the workforce unless we have proper care with our children, proper help with our children. We need government-paid child care centers, regulated places for children to go and be cared for while we are employed in the paid labor force. The importance of child care was recognized as early as 1970 by the landmark Royal Commission on the Status of Women, which called for a national child care plan. The Royal Commission also identified the care of children as a responsibility to be shared by mothers, fathers, and society. Most significantly, the Commission stated that unless this shared responsibility is acknowledged and assumed, women cannot be accorded true equality. This is as true today as it was in 1970. And unfortunately, we're not as much better off as we'd like to think. Now, that was 1970. In 1986, just 16 years later, there was a federal task force on childcare, the first and only one. This expert group had been appointed by Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau prior to leaving office in 1984. And its purpose was to examine and assess the need for childcare and parental leave in Canada, and to make recommendations on the federal government's role in the development of a national system of quality childcare. That was very hopeful in 1986. The task force reported that they recommended a universal system of affordable childcare co-funded by federal and provincial governments. The group envisioned affordable or even free childcare services designed and managed by provinces under national standards, built through a gradual increase in the supply of regulated, not-for-profit facilities. So what happened to it? Well, Brian Mulroney was elected, and his progressive conservative government was elected with him. And the report was immediately shelved in 1984. Then in 1993, Liberal Jean Chrétien became Prime Minister, and the Liberal Red Book of Progressive Policies promised a universal, accessible, and well-funded national child care program. The Red Book was written mostly by his, I'm given to believe, policy advisor Haviva Hosek, who had been an Ontario cabinet minister and a president of the Feminist National Action Committee on the Status of Women. So as you can appreciate, women were very optimistic. Jean Chrétien was in power for 10 years, but the promised child care program did not happen. I don't know why, but there was obviously no political will. Then in 2003, Chrétien's successor, and the man who had been his finance minister, Paul Martin, readied a national plan with the approval and financial support of all the provinces and territories. Federal spending of $1 billion annually was set aside. On the brink of implementation of this not-for-profit system in 2006, a federal election was called. Stephen Harper achieved a minority government for his Conservative Party. Within weeks of taking office, not enough time to really study the matter, within weeks of taking office, Harper dissolved the provincial territorial agreements and unilaterally canceled the planned national child care program. There was no discussion in Parliament at all. The motivation for the decision was clearly ideological rather than financial, as there was a sizable surplus in the federal coffers, and money had been budgeted for it and set aside. Instead, the Harper Conservatives replaced the plan for more childcare spaces with a taxable check of $100 per month for certain families and certain other benefits. Try finding a childcare spot with $100 a month. Justin Trudeau, when he was elected, ended up adding cash to the pool when he became Prime Minister in 2015. But, and this is a big but for me, Trudeau did not act to create more childcare spaces. He added money. For example, a family earning $45,000 a year with one child received from Harper's Conservatives a total of $3,350 a year, and from Trudeau's Liberals, $5,380 a year. The maximum annual benefit currently is $6,400 per child under the age of 6, and up to $5,400 for those aged 6 to 17. But compare that to the cost of taking care of children. Toronto has the highest rates in the country, with an average annual cost in 2017 for an infant of $21,096, for a toddler $16,248, and a preschooler $14,544. Compare these costs with the Canada Child benefit of a maximum annual $6,400 per child. So, tell me how families will pay for, much less find, a childcare spot. So here we are, despite a Royal Commission recommendation in 1970, a task force recommendation in 1984, a government promise in 1993, at a time when a knowledgeable feminist was in an advisory position of power, despite funding having been put aside by every jurisdiction for a national plan in 2006, despite having an avowedly feminist prime minister in office now, we do not have a national child care plan. Child care is not universal, not accessible, and clearly not affordable. We have across Canada in 2018 a total of 1,350,000 regulated child care spaces, which takes care of only 27% of the children who need them. So what happens? Unlicensed, unregulated, potentially unsafe, not always of course, care by a neighbor or family member is sought, or since most women are paid less than their husbands, it's, honey, you have to stay home. You have to give up your job and take care of the kids and reduce your chances of independence and fulfillment. Now, in some families today, it's the fathers who do this, but it's still unfair. Society wants women to have children because they represent the future. It's time that society steps in and provides the help that's needed, and that help includes more than 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. care. Shift workers also need childcare. Families with emergencies need childcare. Weekend care is needed by some. So we know what we need. We've proven the need. It's quite obvious, I think, but how do we achieve it? As far as I'm concerned, we can't rely on promises anymore. Women who believe in the goals of accessible, universal, affordable childcare must become politically active, run for office, and be part of the governing structure. The patriarchy will not give us what we need to be fully equal, so we must place ourselves in positions of power and decision-making. And by this I mean place feminists in positions of power, not lady patriarchs, those women who are handmaidens to the patriarchy. Put people into positions of power who are not misogynists or care little about women. We are 52% of the population. Let's use our power. Now, I have more about this in the third lecture, because this is segmented into 3, where I'm talking about challenging the centers of power. But I will talk then, too, about the political realities that are going to be necessary in order to bring into place a situation where we can actually have advances for women and their families. Pay equity. Now, without properly funded childcare, women and their families must pay personally for the cost of the childcare. But with unequal pay in relation to men's pay, women have an even harder time being able to do so. Until we're paid equally with men, women will never be able to take an equal place in society, be regarded as an equal member of society, or take charge of our own lives, care for our children, and contribute to our family's well-being. And this becomes even more crucial if a woman's marriage breaks down. A woman who is paid equally with men would be less likely to be trapped in a bad or abusive marriage, would be better able to pay for good child care where there was no government program, and would have a better chance of taking care of herself in her later years. Equal pay is a major key to equality and independence. It's also a fundamental right of women to be paid wages that are free of systemic, gender-based discrimination that places less value on women's work than on men's work of comparable value. Now, we've had equal pay laws in Ontario since 1951, when Ontario passed the first law mandating equal pay for the same work. Problem was that women didn't have access to the same jobs as men did. They worked mostly in female ghettos, so the law was ineffective on a practical level. Note that it wasn't a gift from the government in power in 1951 without being pressured. Lawyer Margaret Hindman, leading the Canadian Federation of Business and Professional Women's Clubs, lobbied for it. In the 1970s, the wording was changed to provide equal pay for substantially the same work. The word substantially was added, but that turned out to be ineffective. Then they changed the words again to equal pay for work of equal value. It was moderately effective, but the cases took a long time to be decided, and then for the pay to be made up. It was defined as a comparison of pay rates between men and women working in dissimilar jobs which involved the same skill, effort, and responsibility. In 1984, the federal government passed a Pay Equity Act, applicable to the federal public service. The Ontario Liberals in 1987 passed a Pay Equity Act affecting larger companies as well as the civil service, which was enhanced by the NDP in 1993. This law was proactive and effective because it didn't rely on employee complaints, but on government monitoring. This Pay Equity Act and the Pay Equity Commission did decrease the pay gap between men and women. That didn't last long. Then we got the progressive conservative. The progressive really is not, as a misnomer. The conservative government of Mike Harris, elected in 1995, and he undermined funding, he reduced funding for pay equity in the public service, which reversed the trend, and the pay gap reemerged to old levels. The Service Employees International Union mounted a successful court challenge, but the government entered resistance mode and defied for a long time the court order to pay up. As for the Federal Pay Equity Act passed in 1984, it took the Public Service Alliance of Canada 30 years to get its pay equity complaint against Canada Post heard. 30 years. Their eventual victory had been stalled by Canada Post's appeals and then delays in paying what the court ordered. The case had been launched in 1983, and a victory was declared at the Supreme Court of Canada in 2011. It took another 2 years before Canada Post started to pay the affected women workers, or, given the passage of time, their estates. The process is ongoing. For more than 40 years, the Equal Pay Coalition, spearheaded bravely by feminist labor lawyer Mary Cornish, has called for pay equity and at the same time sought universally accessible, affordable public child care with decent wages for child care workers as part of their fight for pay equity. And unfortunately, their fight goes on. Statistics tell the story. In 1965, women earned on average 41% of men's pay. So if a man earned $1, a woman earned 41 cents. Today, women earn on average, we're told, and the best number I can find is 70 cents for every dollar a man earns. Now, these are average annual earnings for all workers, and I suppose that's an improvement of sorts, but that's 53 years, and it's still only 70 cents on the dollar. And it isn't good enough. Especially when you consider that in Wiltshire, England, in 1604, the rare woman who worked as a laborer in the fields, reaping, earned about 60 cents on the male dollar. Women are still paid less than men in every country of the world. Researchers have concluded that women's historically low wages are based on the supposition of female inferiority, weakness, and dependency. Surprise. Now, we know it's even worse here for Indigenous, racialized, and immigrant women than it is for the average woman. The latest census data show that Indigenous women in Ontario earn 57 cents on the male dollar, racialized women 62 cents, and immigrant women 66 cents on the male dollar. The gap, therefore, isn't new, but I don't think it's inevitable. It's a product of systemic discrimination sustained by employer and government choices. I hope I've made it clear that you have to commit funds to make pay equity real, just as you have to commit funds to make childcare happen. And you can't just pass a law or make a promise. You have to implement it and enforce it in good faith, and then vote to keep out the guys who will destroy it. So we could change the law again to require pay transparency. The Equal Pay Coalition is suggesting that if a job has a salary attached to it, then pay would be based on the job and not the person. Less discretion, it is hoped, would bring less discrimination. In Iceland, companies are required to proactively get equal pay certification from the government saying that they're doing what they're supposed to do, or suffer a fine. They levy, by the way, a maximum penalty, of $500 a day, which, if you figure it out, is $130,000 a year, which won't act as a prevention for most businesses that I know of. They'll just consider it a cost of doing business. So while equal pay certification requirements may help, the fines and the penalties have to be serious. Thirdly, we could change the law to apply employment standards legislation to precarious workers and the gig economy, not only to traditional salaried workers. A disproportionate number of precarious workers are women, and this includes women professionals. Apparently, more than a fifth of Canada's professionals, 22%, are in precarious work of some sort. We need more funding to support the work of our government that has pay equity tribunals and has a pay equity commission, because their fundings have been cut. One more thing, it's a pet idea of mine. Pay equity laws are connected to being employed by others. Maybe the best solution is for many more women to open and run their own businesses. I have a lot of faith in women's ability to do so, and then set the rules that make sense to them. The third aspect of what I want to talk about today is employment equity. Now, most people don't even know what that word means and where it came from. So I'll tell you. In 1983, the federal Pierre Trudeau Liberals established the Royal Commission on Equality in Employment with a mandate to inquire into the most efficient, effective, and equitable means of promoting employment opportunities, eliminating systemic discrimination, and assisting all individuals to compete for employment opportunities. In other words, employment equity is an effort to eliminate systemic discrimination that's built into the structure of employment and businesses. Judge Rosalie Silberman Abella was, have you noticed some of the women's names I'm mentioning here, from Margaret Hyman and the Equal Pay Law in 1951, to Mary Cornish working for the Equal Pay Coalition, to Judge Rosalie Silberman Abella was appointed sole commissioner, she's now a Supreme Court of Canada judge, was appointed sole commissioner, and her report recommended the implementation of what she termed employment equity to proactively establish working conditions that counteracted systemic discrimination in the workplace. The report set out a rationale and process to achieve fairness in the workplace. Now, employment equity was the term that she used to identify what had previously been called affirmative action, a term that had fallen into disfavor because it was ridiculed as requiring mandatory quotas. and that was regarded by many people as a no-no. So look what happened to the effort to secure employment equity and to deal vigorously with systemic discrimination in the workplace. The federal government implemented many of the ideas in the report when it enacted the 1986 Employment Equity Act, affecting the federally regulated private sector companies and crown corporations. The legislation was promising but toothless. The only penalty was for failure to file reports and not for failure to achieve employment equity. In Ontario, on the other hand, Bob Rae's NDP government, when it was elected in 1993, enacted Ontario's Employment Equity Act. This was comprehensive legislation affecting more than 17,000 companies and 75% of all Ontario workers, including all public service employees and businesses with more than 50 employees. Employers were required to establish plans that would identify and take positive measures to eliminate systemic employment barriers. The legislation was disparaged by opponents as a quota system, that bad word again. But it didn't specify quotas at all. It only required companies to have goals and then plan for their achievement. It was also challenged on the misguided assumption that women with no merit would be hired ahead of talented men. That's another bugbear that's often trotted out. This wasn't true, but it was used as an excuse to stall advances for women. Well, this legislation so angered the next government that came into power, Mike Harris's Ontario Conservatives, that when they came into power, they not only dismantled but destroyed the NDP's efforts on this front. They repealed the law. They even took the outrageous step, and unheard of at that time, of requiring companies that had already complied with the legislation to destroy, to shred all information they had secured. The government offices carrying out employment equity was closed, and all the staffs were dismissed. These tactics made the operation even of voluntary programs more difficult and actively prevented the improvement of women's employment situation in those places that had already begun to implement the law. There's been no further employment equity legislation in Ontario in the 25 years since then. Now, the federal law didn't fare much better. Stephen Harper's federal Conservatives quietly undermined the 1986 Federal Employment Equity Act. While it was never tough enough, and the Senate, in fact, had produced 3 reports in 2007, 2010, and 2013 with recommendations to make it work more effectively, the Harper government weakened it further. In 2012, hidden away in a section of a federal budget omnibus bill, the effectiveness of the program was reduced. While the Federal Employment Equity Act and its companion act, the Federal Contractors Program, continued to exist, their rules and funding were undercut and usefulness eroded. Now, some industries are trying to implement systemic changes within their industry. I think of TIFF, the film festival recently came up with a program called Share Her Journey, where they tried to make things more equal for the women. But we haven't had a society-wide consensus on how to deal with systemic discrimination. And individual women continue to believe that their failure to advance reflects their lack of ability or drive or effort, and this is itself a serious problem. When the problem is systemic and women blame themselves, nothing will get changed unless those women who blame themselves understand that it's a systemic problem that has to be dealt with. The solution here again. We've had promises, we've had laws, we've had a succession of governments. Feminists must run for office in winnable ridings, get elected, and take power in order to be in a position to achieve a more equitable world. It's come to that. The third aspect of women at work, and I talked about this in a different context, in the context of violence against women last time, is sexual harassment, but it bears repeating because it's very much related to women at work, the way it stands now. Sexual harassment developed as a prohibition under human rights law and is considered discrimination. It is not regarded as a crime, as sexual assault is. It is my view that sexual harassment is taken less seriously because it is considered discrimination, mostly within the workplace. I propose that it should be prohibited as part of the Federal Criminal Code, as part of the sexual assault continuum. If it were a criminal offense, it would have to be taken seriously. The police, instead of the employer, would have to deal with it, and the concerns of the people about the absence of due process when employers deal with it would be gone, as rules of evidence and criminal law would apply to determine guilt and consequences. Employers will still have to have a process in place to guard against toxic workplaces and be proactive in establishing and circulating to staff a carefully considered and enforced list of behavioral standards, which encourages bystanders to be part of the solution, by the way. Employers will have to be aware of the subtle mechanisms by which organizations maintain the status quo. Research reports that most women have suffered harassment at work. Those who told their human resources department or a supervisor were, in this research report that I read, for the most part, persuaded to drop the issue, not to make waves. We have to change the thinking about that. And even if an employee were to sue an employer for permitting a toxic workplace and condoning harassment, the damage awards in Ontario have been very low, maybe $10,000, hardly worth taking it forward from a financial perspective. So, make sexual harassment a crime, and there's a good chance that it will happen less frequently. And as I said last time, make online harassment, defamation, and stalking of women a crime. I talked about online issues last time. And ban anonymity on the internet. There's a whole paragraph or three to go with that, but I'll just give you that little summary. I'm going to talk next, the fifth item is women at the top of the working world. And let me just remind you that there's a question and answer period after, and you should be thinking up and the questions and comments you wish to make. Now, it's been a long and slow haul to get more women at the leadership level in the management of large corporations and on their corporate boards. The policy over many years has been some version of voluntary. Voluntary doesn't work. The Institute for Governance of Private and Public Organizations issued a report in 2009 saying that since 1990, the percentage of women directors on boards of North American publicly traded corporations had stalled at 15%, that's 1-5. The chair of its board commented candidly that the reasons involved to explain this situation, quote, have since become largely excuses or equivocations, end quote. Well, they certainly know what the truth is. They recommended a 40% gender equality target, as well as other proposals which they summarized as advocating, now listen to this wording, quote, a gradual voluntary approach in a clear commitment to increasing the proportion of women on corporate boards at an accelerated rate. This sounds like a very complicated way of saying voluntary to me, and is much too slow. It's not as if there aren't very competent women trained and ready to go, ready to participate at the highest levels of business and corporate life. Now, in 2014, Status of Women Canada laid out a plan to promote more women to corporate boards. They called them, another word for voluntary, aspirational goals for Canadian business and public sectors to achieve a national goal of 30% by 2019. Now, the Ontario Securities Commission, in an effort to improve the situation, came up with a policy called Comply or Explain, which was adopted by other securities regulators across Canada at the end of 2014 as part of corporate disclosure requirements. In this Comply or Explain approach, Firms must disclose whether they have a written policy on selecting corporate female directors, whether they take gender representation into account in composing their governance structures, and whether they have adopted numerical targets for women on their boards and in their executive offices. And if companies haven't done these things, they must explain why. The challenges include facing the fact that most men on boards think there isn't a gender representation problem at all. And research also shows that boards with women on them outperform their competitors. I wish those researchers would talk to each other. No questions until the end. All the studies show clearly that women are underrepresented at every level, and the situation is improving, if at all, at a snail's pace. Recent statistics show just how unsuccessful these efforts continue to be. Several weeks ago, securities regulatory authorities in Alberta, Manitoba, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Ontario, Quebec, and Saskatchewan, who are trying to apply the comply or explain rule, published their 4th review since 2015 of the effectiveness of comply or explain. The results summarize a review of 648 companies. The total percentage of board seats held by women went from 11% in 2015 to 15% in 2018. I'd like to know what explanation would explain that. Issuers that adopted targets for the representation of women on their boards increased to 16% in 2018 from 7% in 2015. The number of issuers with at least one woman in executive officer positions increased to 66% in 2018 from 60% in 2015. And almost 40% of companies still have no women on their boards. And of new board vacancies, 74% were filled by men. At this rate, we won't get equality there until hell freezes over. Comply or explain is only a step above voluntary and unlikely to be successful. Voluntary is based on the expectation that well-meaning people will, in good faith, act fairly because it's the right thing to do, and they might feel shame or embarrassment if found out. I doubt that. For the most part, people make change because they have to. We can count on rules being followed if they're backed up by meaningful penalties, but we can't count on voluntary acts of fairness because it's the right thing to do. The penalties for an action will have to be more severe if we're going to achieve change. Disclosure and explanation does not equal action. Some people would say give it time. I think we have, don't you think? I'm, for one, not prepared to continue to give it time. The time for patience has passed. I think it's time for women to be impatient. What we need are quotas. I know it's a word that people don't like to face, but I think that quotas are the only way that we're going to achieve equality for women in the workplace and in boards and in management. Because if we have women who believe in women at the top of management and on corporate boards, there is hopefully a trickle-down effect possible there. Who knows? Women have to be in charge of these companies. The time has come to give up on voluntary. By the way, Norway adopted a quota system in 2008. It was picked up by such countries as France, Italy, Belgium, Germany, and Iceland. The result? They increased the number of women on boards and in executive roles, and have done so at a pace that far exceeds anything we've seen in Canada. Moreover, Norwegian directors came to agree that quotas were necessary. As one Norwegian director confessed to a researcher, quote, "If a new category of society shall be given power, someone will have to give away that power, and that's not an easy thing to do. So we need quotas." Smart man, brave man. I've talked today about our history in 5 key areas of women's labor force participation. Some of this is also in my book, Fairly Equal, Lawyering the Feminist Revolution, and I have a few copies here today for purchase for those who are interested. The history of our efforts and achievements and resistance to them by the governing patriarchy must lead us to the conclusion that there is a lot of work to do. We need women to run for high political office to ensure that all of this happens. We need women at the centers of power. Women must go into politics, but not just any woman. It must be women who have goals to create equality of power for women. They must be feminists and understand what that means. They must believe in women and not be handmaidens to the patriarchy. And we need male feminist allies and a committed and vigilant sisterhood, women who are not themselves misogynists. So, dear friends, you must take control or the status quo will remain. It's up to you. And next month, I'll be talking about challenging the centers of power, where I hope to pull all of this together. Thank you, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you, that was wonderful. Yesterday we had election results, and I know that there was a woman in my riding running for councillor. She was the single mother of a single mother, very impressive candidate. And I know she lost to a councillor who is apparently under a cloud and under investigation. Do you know if there are any stats on the number of women who ran in our recent Toronto municipal election, or the municipal elections generally, and what the results of the women to men are? For example, I know in Brampton, a woman incumbent who had been in office for, I think, almost 2 decades, lost to Mr. Brown, parachuted in. So I don't know if you know, but do you know if anyone has even looked at the stats? It's one thing to say women need to run for power. But when women do put themselves out there, who is supporting them? And what happens to them once they lose?
Well, no, I don't have the statistics, and I think it's very difficult to come up to any conclusions based upon yesterday's election, given the extraordinary thing that happened to reduce the size of council, and therefore people who may have had a good shot at becoming a member of council, some of the women that you're talking about, suddenly when it was cut from 47 to 25, had much less chance of getting ahead. So I don't think looking at that as any way to know whether women could succeed or not, but what it does show is that some politicians engage in bully behavior. We give them majority power, and they use it, and we know who we're talking about. But I think, and we'll talk about the next time, that there's something got to be done about the electoral system to prevent these huge lurches of majority power from one party to another party. So one party brings in some good things, and suddenly the next one gets rid of them because the other guys did it. There's something wrong with a system that works like that. They're supposed to be governing in the public interest. That's not the feeling that I'm getting. And I think that for women who are running and not winning, I think we need an organizational structure in a revitalized women's movement to help them. There's a lot of work to be done, and a lot of ways in which it can be done. But it's very difficult to say to individual women, go out on your own and make these changes yourself that are going to affect all of society. I think we have to put together, not everybody wants to run. Some people can afford to support, other people can knock on doors, other people can do organizational work. But it's got to be a goal first of women that we want to achieve this. And if we have that goal and we find people to go along with us and work with us on it, then I think it's achievable. We're 52% of the population, and they aren't all lady patriarchs. By the way, I did last time, I'll give due credit. That expression is not something my creation. It was the late, great Ursula Franklin who created that, and it just simply evokes so much in the two words, you know. Okay. 32%, this gentleman has a paper that says 32% of the incoming council will be women. Okay.
My question was, you said that if there's a woman on the board in the company performs better. For what reasons does it perform better? Why does it perform better?
Well, the researchers did an overall analysis of it, and that's what they concluded. I think that what they were saying was that women have unique characteristics and talents to bring to bear, and I can't possibly repeat them for you right here, but that women do have unique things to add, that we're not just lady men. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
So, is this, yeah, okay. So, Linda, you're brilliant as always. This was wonderful. I'm going to tell a quick little anecdote, but the question that I'll pose the question, then tell the anecdote so that I'm actually asking a question. So that we don't leave here with total despair, but we leave here with some hope. What are some of the ways in which women have made gains? Where are some of the positives? Like, that's one question. The second one is, what can we do to prevent subsequent governments from taking away, really what we're talking about is human rights? I mean, you know, so that's two. But can I tell one little quick anecdote? Quick. Okay, so the quick one is that Linda and I both were on the Status of Women Council in Ontario, and in my year or time that I was on, we had the president of the Royal Bank come and join us for a meeting, and the question was, when are you going to get a woman on the board of the Royal Bank? And he said, ladies, I'm so glad that you've invited me today. He said, but what would we do with a woman on the board? We've already picked the color of the drapes. Oh. So Laura Sabia was the chair of the Status of Women Council. Yeah. And what we did was we wrote to the newspaper, and we invited women to move their money from the Royal Bank to any other bank of their choice, and within 10 days we had a woman on the board.
Yeah, but Barbara, at that time, there was a Status of Women Council. They've been wound up.
Yeah.
There is still one federal. No, there isn't one federally. No. It's all within a government. There aren't any advisory councils. Even the Advisory Committee on Violence Against Women, a mostly volunteer group that Kathleen Wynne set up, has been removed by our current premier.
And all the anti-racism and all the
yes.
all of that stuff. Everything.
So you want me to be positive. Okay. What advances have we made? Now, we're talking about empowering women at work now. I'm talking about this area.
Yeah.
Okay. There are more childcare spaces now than there were 50 years ago. Definitely.
When we were on the council, we had 20 spaces for children that were within the age of maternity leave. You could take 9 weeks before and 7 weeks after, I think, or the vice versa.
Okay.
Yeah, and there were 20 spaces.
Okay.
So we're doing better.
So being positive, there are more childcare spaces. It's just that serving 27% of the children aren't enough.
Right.
Pay equity, we have laws that we did not have then. We have a government agency in Ontario, the Pay Equity Commission, the Pay Equity Tribunals, that do their very best to deal with the problem, and it's better than it used to be. It's just not good enough. Employment equity, as I said, we've not had a law in 25 years. Sexual harassment, we know, is a serious problem in the workplace and many other places. It's a problem. And I'm not sure that we've really dealt with it as a society, except we are in a situation now with the Me Too movement that women have come forward, that women aren't just saying, I'm going to accept the status quo. This is huge. This is absolutely enormous advance that women have made that decision. And I'd like to see women make the decision to do much more, to fight for much more change.
And
That's a good start.
And we have Kavanaugh and Patrick Brown.
Okay, you're not talking into a mic now, so.
That's it.
So, and in terms of women on corporate boards, I read you the statistics. It went from 11 to 15%. There's obviously a whole lot more to do. It's not that nothing has happened. It's that not enough has happened, that a lot of what has happened has been pulled back or defunded, or it's in implementation delayed, right? All of those things. Now, your next question was, what? What can we do?
Well, what can we do to prevent subsequent governments from taking away human
Well, that I'm going to talk about in the next lecture. Yeah, I don't, let's stick with this one, but I can't set up a problem as I have this time and last time without trying to come up with the solution, and I think I've got it. So you're just going to have to come back. Florence?
Thank you, Linda. Always, always so instructive. I'd like to build on the positive idea that there are some shifts in the demographics that lead us to believe women have hope. There are currently a majority of females in all the professions of law, medicine, pharmacy, engineering now than there ever has been. So we've reached over 50%. More women go to university than have ever in the past. And I don't have the data for yesterday's election, but there are more women in Canadian Parliament and in the Ontario Parliament than there have ever been. So there have been increases. My big fear and worry is that our young women at university age and their parents have become complacent with the gains that we have made, that we who have bumped our heads against the glass ceiling and have fought. In some professions, the women are teaching, majority of leadership are now among women. And there is something about that makes them say, well, we've got here, but we haven't. We've got some superficial examples. So I love the idea of activism and formalizing groups, and I think they should be at the university and high school level, where women get women to understand. I mean, even with my own granddaughter, I've had to ask some very pointed questions like, what do your friends think about? Oh, we haven't really talked about it. So, talk to them and let's talk about it. Much more of that has to happen because they aren't aware. They think they've got it good.
Well, I think in the schools, they have to have education on women's issues. They have to really teach them what the reality is at an early age. That has to be part of the history or civics or whatever occurs, social studies, or its own subject. Now, you're right, Florence, that there's lots of women in the professions now. And I've been speaking about my book to a number of women lawyers groups. And I have to say that things aren't as much better as they should be, given that women lawyers, just speaking of that profession, are a critical mass in the profession. There are many of them who leave big firms because they can't have a balanced life. They can't have a family. They have to work ungodly hours. Or they just don't feel they're being treated fairly, one way or the other. And many of them are leaving. So while we've got more women in that profession, I don't know myself about how it works out in medicine, because I think given that we in OHIP have a fee structure, I would think that it would prevent a certain amount of inequity, the inequities in pay, but, I don't know that. But, so it's not the critical mass that makes the difference. It's the fact that there has to be change in the culture at the highest levels. And that's what hasn't happened, certainly within the legal profession, from what I understand. Okay.
So how do you actually become a candidate to be on a corporate board? If, as a woman, you think, you agree with what you've said about more women make better companies, how do you put yourself forward, or how do you get considered for those positions?
Well, I believe that there's an organization called Catalyst that's their goal, is to get more women on corporate boards. And if you are interested in doing that, you should be in touch with them for information, because I would suspect that they help create lists that when boards have decided we do want some women, although the likelihood of them going away from their comfort zone to people on a list, I'm not sure how that would work. But the other way, I do believe, and I'm no expert on this, is there are directors' courses being given for people who want to be on corporate boards. They're given at the universities. Both York and University of Toronto have those kinds of courses for directors. And I assume that the professors, when they see the talent that is in their class, have some means of connecting that talent up with some of the corporations. So that's two means. Okay.
Hi, Linda. I really enjoyed your talk. I enjoyed the last one as well. I'm an HR manager at a law firm in downtown Toronto, and last
You're
year...
the interim manager?
The HR manager.
HR, okay.
Yeah. So I work with lawyers all day long, and last year when the Law Society announced that they were changing the requirements for your license to include a statement of principles and a policy of diversity and inclusion, there was a major uproar, and I had so many pointless conversations in my office with people who said, how dare the Law Society say to me how I'm going to make up my firm? And there were so many conversations where it was just really frustrating and frankly disheartening. Moving into the next stage, there are other levels that you have to get to over the course of the next couple of years, but do you have any recommendations or strategies of ways to reach other lawyers to get them understanding why this might be important? And lawyers are logical people, really smart, logical people, but these conversations have really gone nowhere for me. So I'm asking from your point of view if you've got anything to add or anywhere to go.
So what you're saying is, you're confirming what I said a moment ago about how women are being treated within law firms, and you're saying that people from diverse groups are not getting the benefit of the Law Society's new statement of principles. Well, it's what I said during my talk. I think that expecting a culture change like that to be voluntary is unrealistic. I think that there's going to have to be quotas. Especially, in the legal profession now, there are a lot of people from a lot of different groups who it's not a white male profession anymore, but you wouldn't know that if you looked at the people leading the large firms. So there has to be a culture change. I don't know how you, as an HR director, could deal with it, except bringing forward lots of good candidates who don't fit the standard mold.
I do that all the time.
Good for you. Good for you.
You want to change the society into a matriarchal society?
Oh, that would be good.
Because that's not happening.
No.
We live in a patriarchal society. Most societies in the world are patriarchal societies, as we all know. There were few societies were run by native women chiefs that were matriarchal societies, but if you, in today's societies, and they always been since existence of the world, And since humans started living, they were run by men, patriarchal societies. So that's the way it is. Now,
Well, that's the way it was.
isn't it now the same way today?
Well, that's the way it has been. I mean,
And
put it in
today?
any, I'd like to think of
What's
it.
the situation today?
No, I don't disagree
Are
with
we living
you.
in patriarchal
I
society?
don't think we
And indeed, aren't most societies in the world are patriarchal?
Yes.
Yes, we agree. Okay, so that statement been made. And what about women who are not feminists?
I beg your pardon?
What about women that are not feminists?
Yes?
Yeah. I don't know what's your definition of feminism, but even to talk to the same effect as to why men are in charge, if you look in the origins of Christianity, who was made first? It says that the man was made first. It was not even the woman. It's not to say that I believe any of this, but it's just it's
Well, that's
there.
because a man wrote the book.
And how the, yes, the man also wrote the book. Just give you some outlook on this, and how the woman was made then. A rib was taken from the man, and there was
Yeah.
made a woman, right? So there is something here as an example of inferiority of the woman to the man, just an example from the, religious perspective, let's say, right? Okay, so in Canada, rape is not a crime, apparently. Also, we have only sexual assault as crime. And I read research recently regarding women in workplace that said that the way women treat other women in the workplace is a lot worse than the way the men treat women in the same workplace. There is research done recently about that the women are harassing other women and competing and driving them to tears, basically. If you're interested to look into this research. And now, there are societies in the world that have equal pay,
That have what?
that have equal pay for men and women, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. But they are not here, not in this country.
Okay.
So, for example, because we live in capitalist society, if you take communist society, the pay is equal, as a matter
Okay.
of fact, in communist societies.
Okay. Let me try and answer some of your
I can
questions.
give you even an example of
No,
a
no.
country. Yeah.
Let me answer some of what you've had to say, if you don't mind.
Yeah, or you can comment as well.
Yeah, so why don't you take a seat so somebody else can ask the next question. Let me just say that I agree that society has been patriarchal. I discussed that at great length in my first talk, where I talked about how the origins of how men and women have interacted, and the reason being that in early societies, men had the brute strength, and women had a responsibility for reproduction with no control over being, when they're going to get pregnant or what the pregnancy was going to be like, and that was how the society was formed. The religions continued to think that way. As I mentioned last time, they talked about a husband and wife being one person in law and in the religious context. So there's a long history that's brought us to this day, but that long history should not define what our future is unless we want it to. That's really all I'm saying. Yes, we live in a patriarchy, but women have to accept that they have the ability to be in control. There's a lot of women that end up really maintaining that feeling of dependency and not feeling independent. And as a result, they don't take the bull by the horns, so to speak, and take charge. And I think that's something that has to change. Women have to think differently. Let me just give you one example of that. There was a book written in 1915 called Herland about a matriarchal society. And throughout the book, this society, all women ran it beautifully, exceptionally well. And at the end of the story, 3 men wander in from who knows where. It was a story after all. And they're appalled by the fact that there are women in charge. So they ridicule them and they put them down. And they, 3 men and this whole community of women the three men managed to talk them out of their matriarchal society. And that's fiction, but to me, that really says a lot about women's lack of self-confidence and lack of willingness to accept that maybe they have the right answer and the men don't. So, by the way, rape is still a crime, only it's called sexual assault.
So not in criminal code, rape is not a crime.
It is. It's just not called rape anymore. It's called sexual assault.
It's not called rape, yeah.
Okay.
Hi, Linda, really great to be here and hear you. You were talking about medicine and not having any experience of that. I was in the Faculty of Medicine. I'm not a medical doctor, but as a researcher. And one of the problems I saw, and I think this is something that we need to think about, is that we can't always say that women and men work in the same way. In research, for example, particularly the way research is funded, where it's grant funded and your career depends on getting grants, men work very competitively, and a lot of women don't find that a comfortable way to work. They want to work cooperatively. And so there are many aspects of work where women often turn their back on it because, you know, the testosterone level is too high for them, and they really would prefer to be in an environment that's more nurturing and more cooperative. And that doesn't work in research because, you know, if I get a grant, the guy next door doesn't get a grant, or, you know, you have to be cutthroat competitive. And I think we really do have to think about different modes of working and different emotional responses that women and men have to work.
Thank you. That's very interesting, and that's so true when you talk about the difference in male and female styles. But where is it written that society has to be set up according to the male style? I mean, seriously. Now, it's true, people who are competitive and cutthroat and ruthless generally manage to get their way with those who aren't willing to put up a fight. But there's different ways of putting up fights. Any other questions? Okay, I guess that concludes this evening. Next time is November the 20th, Challenging the Centers of Power. I think I've given you enough tidbits to know that there's going to be some interesting stuff at that next talk. Thank you very much.